Hi, my name is Dr. Katindi Sivi, and I'm an African futurist. I started this futures journey 20 years ago when I got employed at the Institute of Economic Affairs in Kenya, which is a local think tank that really does research and policy analysis. The biggest concern at the time was the fact that we were approaching our third multi-party elections, and the two previous elections had been very acrimonious and very divisive. And so as a research organization, they were looking for a way in which organizations or people, they could steer the debate into a much more meaningful one, and in a sense try and get people to think about a leadership that was going to be suitable for the country. So they did a lot of research around different aspects of Kenya's politics and economics, and then eventually did a scenarios building process for 1 year. I came into the project about when they were doing the dissemination part of the project. And so the process was really to go around the country to involve citizens into discussing these issues. So one of the scenarios, there were 4 scenarios that came out of that process. The first scenario was the El Nino scenario. And the El Nino scenario was basically saying that Kenya had all the ingredients of a civil conflict. The second scenario was an economic scenario, saying that Kenya's future, it was possible for Kenya to grow at a very to have a high economic growth rate, partly because Kenya is strategically placed within the continent and is an entry point for a lot of, whether it's organizations and also in the region. And so we had the possibility of actually growing at a much higher rate than we were growing. But the problem with that scenario is that we didn't have the institutional mechanism to have a equal distribution of wealth. And so because of that, it was seen as a scenario that was going to propagate a lot of inequality in the country. The third scenario was a political scenario that was called the Katiba scenario. And in this scenario, we were saying that because of the past governance issues that the country was going through, it was important for us to review the constitution and to, in a sense, begin to ask ourselves whether we have reached the limits of our institutions. Based on that, then, the scenario was seen as a plausible one, but one where it was going to be a really uphill task based on the fact that, a lot of people, there was a lot of contestation and a lot of interest in terms of whose interest goes first and how do we balance all these interests. So based on those, the last scenario was a much more visionary scenario, much more idealistic, that was saying that for Kenya to move forward in an ideal way, we needed a fundamental political shift and a fundamental economic change. And based on that, then they wanted a scenario that was looking at the aspirations of Kenyans. So in disseminating these 4 scenarios around the country, depending on what preferences people had, some preferred the much more political and others the much more economic scenario. What was interesting though is that there was almost a public consensus that the El Nino scenario could never happen because a lot of people did not want to be able to face a future where there was conflict in the country. And in fact, to their defense, they said a lot of times that Kenya was an island of peace and all its neighbors, we hosted the refugees from our all the neighbors. The last scenario was seen as impractical because it was too aspirational. Fast forward, maybe 7 years later, almost 3 of the 4 scenarios actually did come to pass. The first scenario, in 2002, the elections, we elected a president whose background was economics. And so the obvious policies that were a preference to that government were much more economic growth inclined. And so as the scenarios had sort of like predetermined, the country there was much more inequality. People were feeling like the cost of living is a bit too high, inflation was growing and so forth. And so in a sense, we started walking through a Maendeleo street. In 2005, there was an opportunity for us to try and amend the constitution because that was one of the administration promises during the campaigns. But it failed because, of course, of all the vested interests there, and it never went through. And in 2007, we actually went through the El Nino road because we had a disputed election and the country just pretty much started burning. And it is in 2007 that people started talking about this piece of work that had been done by Institute of Economic Affairs on the possible future of Kenya and how accurate it was in describing the last 7 years of the country. And so people started really thinking about scenarios as a very creative and very accurate way of thinking about strategy. But the problem with that is that as a public interest scenario, people then took it as a work of prediction. And I must add that even if we say scenarios are not predictive, depending on the level of complexity, it is very possible to have some form of accuracy. And that accuracy comes to play because of also the fact that because also the level at which we were doing this was at a national level and the driving forces were pretty much obvious. And so we were just putting into context and in a sense putting a method into the madness in relation to all the signs that were there around us. So that begins the history of futures thinking in Kenya. And for me, the biggest lesson there was, unlike corporate scenarios, a lot of times it is very easy, first of all, to bypass the research part of it. And a lot of people want to do scenarios quickly. But one of the lessons I learned from this project is that it's a process that takes time. With good research, then you're able to do very good scenarios. But unfortunately, a lot of times just people delve into scenarios thinking without that background research. I think the second thing for me was that a lot of times it is done at the very high level and we don't disseminate this information to people to own the process. But the biggest lesson for me from this work was the fact that we never used this work to actually influence decision making, because what happened in those 7 years could have been averted had we used the scenarios for decision making processes. And so that has been an interesting lesson that we have carried forward in the country, and particularly for myself as a futurist. The second piece of work that I was involved in, and it in a sense is the second big project in futures and scenarios thinking in Kenya, was a project I spearheaded while still at the Institute of Economic Affairs called the Kenya Youth Scenarios Project. And in short, we call it KEYS. And in this project, and I think the question was just the bulging youth population that we were beginning to notice, the fact that you have a lot of idle young people and the unemployment levels were also quite high. And it was interesting to see policy discussions having a sense of this is a problem, but not having a way to fully express it. So the project, in a sense, gave again sense into all this that we were seeing and started delving into the issues of what might the future look like with a youth bulge question at the center of it. One of the interesting things about this project is then that based on the lessons that we had been learning as an institution from the first project, was then to have a grassroots, rather than disseminate the end product, we wanted to start with the grassroots and build up to the experts. And so we sort of like went around the country, did about 8 workshops in different regions of the country, and tried to have discussions with young people about where they see the future of the country. It was a very interesting project because based on, it was like living in 8 different countries. And so we consolidated this work and we eventually presented it to policymakers. The scenarios were pretty grim, and I think it was a bit unpalatable for these people who have such a sense of maybe interest and, a stake in the country. They couldn't digest how these young people who over and over again were feeling disenfranchised and excluded, they couldn't see that point of view of the scenarios. And so it didn't have a lot of traction at the policy level at the time. But it was interesting because we began seeing very interesting trends after that work. So the first one is, of course, being a public interest scenario, it is public attribution usually is not there. But a lot of the language that was being used in the scenarios process made it to policy documents. We started noticing that, government was allocating more resources to youth projects and programs. We started noticing that a lot of the institutions that had received the pieces of work that we had done around it got a sense of urgency. So in one part of the stakeholders, it created inertia and fear, but on another end, it created a lot of sense of urgency. What was also very interesting about this project is that we saw, for example, religious institutions take their youth ministries a bit more, with a bit more urgency, and a lot of researchers began emerging around youth demographics, and a lot of projects then, of course, on youth employment initiatives began at that point. What was also interesting is that the 2013 elections, 3 years later from when we did the work, the campaigns from all the different candidates were actually centered on the centrality of young people and how important they are. So I think we did influence the conversation in that sense. And obviously, it was very interesting to look at that work from that point of view. Now, one of the interesting things about this piece that we can learn from is that even if scenarios are used for decision making, sometimes policies, one of the things I think we need to understand is that the policy making process is a political process. And so there are a lot of instances where, yes, the politician said all the well-meaning things, but when the money was allocated to youth ministries, a lot of corruption, the money was stolen, and it really did not benefit young people. So again, the idea is to leverage and see how can we use scenarios then to begin to also make this very political process beneficial to the end user at the end of the day. I think the other lesson for me was, how do you balance between very grim scenarios with some hope, and in a sense begin to use that properly to just balance the feelings that it gives. Okay, one of the most interesting things from the two processes is how much they were used by government also for policy. In the first, the Kenya at the Crossroads project, I remember after the election violence process, they began saying, okay, we need to galvanize the country back to its feet, and we need a vision. And so the Flying Geese scenario became a reference point for creating a vision for the country. And so because of the work that we had been doing, I was co-opted into that process, and I was part of the team that did write the vision and wrote the medium-term plan. The third interesting piece of work was around the 2013 elections, when the two candidates that then eventually ascended into power were actually had been ICC inductees, because they were accused of having masterminded the 2007 elections. And it was very interesting because governance civil society organizations then began to feel hostility and a sense of authoritarianism returning to the political space, because they had been, the champions of, the prosecutions of these two individuals taking place. And so when the two candidates then eventually were the ones that formed the current government, the institutions were worried about their own existence, the hostility, and so they wanted to do scenarios around the future, their own future, in relation to being able to survive this kind of hostile environment. And so they called me in to sort of like have that discussion. And this scenario was very interesting for us because it did paint a picture of what could happen to the civil society organizations. So on one end, it was very clear that a lot of them were targeted and their survival was at stake, was really at stake. But what we noted from this scenario is that it was very difficult for us to pass on a message about other interesting drivers of change. So for example, in one instance, we were beginning to notice that the donor funding was reducing. All right, and it was going to be a major point of hemorrhage for civil society organizations. But they were so bent on the successes they had had in the 90s, where they were able to operate successfully in an authoritarian sort of like environment, but with much more funding. And so they felt an authoritarian government meant that resources then would come to them. But even if the scenarios were saying otherwise, they couldn't plan with that in mind. They planned with a future where then they would be the go-to institutions for, for financing. And now fast forward a little, and indeed the environment was changing, and indeed the resources were declining. And so a lot of them actually had to close because, of course, of the recessions and, of course, all those things that were going on. And the lesson we learned from the scenarios process for us was the fact that a lot of people do not, they take the messages they prefer from the scenarios and really do not want to strategize around what they don't want to see. And so because of that, we started having, they were caught flat-footed, and even if they had done a very good scenarios piece, it still was not useful for them to be prepared for that kind of eventuality. And so the lesson to learn here is that, again, scenarios process, the stories are not useful in themselves, and that the only benefit that scenarios brings on board is for you to be able to make fundamental decisions that will help you, thrive in times of uncertainty and in times of crisis. And so that has been our experience, and Kenya is one of the places where scenarios thinking has now become very popular. With an election coming in 2 years' time, there's a lot of scenarios work that is going around, whether it's political violence or, the constitution. Now they talk about the constitution being amended, and so there's scenarios work around that. Institutions like electoral bodies and others are already beginning to do scenarios so that they can be more prepared for that eventuality. Now, one of the things for me, I think, as a foresight practitioner, is the fact that we need, as people who are going to be thinking about futures, it is important for us to instill a culture of futures thinking. It shouldn't be an event. So I get a lot of calls during, for example, before elections, but it should be that we should be doing this long-term planning as a cycle and as a culture, so that those scenarios can be much more beneficial for us. And so that's another lesson that is important to pass on to you. And the other thing is that a lot of times we tend to do this in an excluded way, or we don't invest enough time, enough resources onto the process. I think there's no quick fix. If we want to get a good product that will help us with good decision making, you have to invest time, resources, but also involve all stakeholders to be able to get the whole spectrum covered. Thank you very much, and that's been our experience in Kenya.